These are prescription drugs. You know about them. They can save lives, or they can prove addictive. They can risk killing patients before they are fully vetted or safety, as safety considerations are taken into account. So while they can be life-saving, we all know that prescription drugs need to be vetted for safety. Or take cigarettes. Less safe by their very nature. They have huge health impacts. They've been more regulated over time as medical science has progressed. Or here's some food. Packaged products, dairy products, billions of these edible products course through the U.S. annually, reaching virtually every home and every person. All these items have one thing in common in the U.S. They're regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, where public safety and medical expertise is supposed to be the driving mission, and the stakes can be high. And the fact that we're not always thinking about this stuff or how it's regulated, the sort of less visible hand of federal regulation, is a good thing. That usually means things are working, not falling apart, and you don't have to think about the things you see right here on your screen. I mean, most Americans have heard of the FDA, but few people know who leads it, and that's usually logical, because Congress designed the FDA and its staff to be mostly nonpartisan experts, doing important but dry, tedious jobs most of the time, not a place for political fireworks. But Trump's new slashing of the federal government, sometimes exceeding congressional intent and legal authority, has hit the FDA, purging over 80 staff. The FDA's chief now resigning in protest, which is why I showed you a couple photos to remind us all of the real-world stakes here, blowing the whistle that the firings demanded by the Trump administration had no rational plan, no findings of concern or evidence of waste or fraud, objecting to Donald Trump's indiscriminate firing of over 80 FDA staff and experts. And this is amidst the sharpening backlash and protests to Trump and his partner, Elon Musk's, effort to cut and gut the federal government. So now we're hitting the nation's food safety. And a sign of how this is working, the FDA also says it accidentally, under these rush demands, had to fire people working right now on bird flu, which they're now calling an accident and trying to rehire them. Accident may be a generous term if the whole thing is, as the FDA chief said, completely indiscriminate to begin with. It's not just an accident, it's that you didn't have a discriminating or serious plan to begin with. You did not discriminate between the people working on the emergency bird flu problem and maybe the other people who are relevant but not working on an ongoing emergency basis. They did not do that discrimination, according to the FDA chief, about the Trump cuts. Meanwhile, we have the resignation of a top Social Security official after objecting to what could have been unlawful efforts by Musk to seize sensitive financial and health data on over 70 million Americans. So the concern about food safety collides with the reliability of seniors' expected checks, which again goes to everyone's safety and well-being. One veteran of that office warning the cuts could risk an interruption in benefits that could hit millions. While scientific and space agencies are facing these major layoffs, Trump officials also ousting health staff on this past Valentine's weekend. Trump also softening the actual fraud enforcement across his own agencies, firing most of the watchdog IGs. Now remember, like other things in government, you might not think about the IGs that much day to day, but these are the watchdogs that patrol waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct. They're the empowered investigators who literally do the work, and they have just been ousted like so many other staff, which gives away the game. Musk has also been caught making up examples of spending fraud when he couldn't find it, at least over the last 3 weeks in his new experimental government role. He was caught in false claims about Social Security spending and false claims about government spending on condoms. We're not going to repeat the entirety of the false claims on this newscast, just as we don't use his chosen acronym for his efficiency group, which promotes crypto he holds. He named it after that acronym, hoping that everyone would, and many people do, just repeat it. Marketing, business, that's something he apparently still knows how to do. But his role running that group is also facing pressure in court, which brings me to the Alice in Wonderland of it all tonight. Courts are one place that could swiftly limit Musk. They can issue rulings that limit whether federal workers listen to him at all. And so now Trump's lawyers are making an Alice in Wonderland-style argument, trying to outrun any court problems for themselves. So they're literally claiming in a new filing that Elon Musk is not running the efficiency group that he runs, saying Musk is not technically part of it at all, the White House saying in court papers. Well, that's technically false and literally false. But this odd denial today, I don't know if you've heard about it yet, actually shows how the heat is getting to Musk and the Trump White House, because their strategy has been to have Musk effectively run or shape large parts of governing without the rules that apply to even seemingly less important people than Musk right now, like the cabinet members. Now, we've reported on this ploy. If you remember, I told you that this was all part of a strategy to protect Musk as much as they could while he does whatever he wants. This new filing today adds confirmation about that tactic. Trump's lawyers are claiming, I mentioned the article, here's what they actually say, quote, Musk is a senior advisor to the president, not the administrator of that advisory group. Trump's lawyers need to claim that Musk's role is very small, that he's not doing what he's actually doing. And the reasons why matter. And remind you, we still live in a system of checks and balances, even as they are being very harshly tested. They need to claim his role is small or that he doesn't do what he's actually doing, because if the courts were to find that Musk's role was large enough and he's essentially an agency administrator or essentially a cabinet member, then the courts could force him to follow the rules of other officials, from transparency to arm's length divestment from his companies, which, knowing Elon Musk, he'd have to then choose rather than having it both ways right now. He might just choose to stay involved with Tesla and his other companies and drop this whole thing. But those kind of court orders would mean, if they were against Trump and Musk, federal officials, employees wouldn't listen to him. Right now, you've seen the push and pull of people saying, well, I guess if he has this role and he's reporting into the president, I guess they have to listen to him. And we haven't been tested like this, not by an outside, super rich billionaire advisor official. We know Donald Trump likes the spotlight, but he's done this rare presidential joint TV interview with an advisor. This is a clip. The full thing has not aired yet with Sean Hannity. When is the last time, if you look at this, you can think of a sitting president sharing an interview with another person other than perhaps their partner? We see that sometimes if it's their wife, but this guy's not even in the cabinet, and they're doing this joint interview. All of this was deliberate, trying to defend the relationship and say, hey, we're not embarrassed by how much it seems like we're co-presidenting. We're going to do an interview together. But there are signs of pressure and cracks, particularly when the White House is putting out legal filings that contradict what the president says. People may be used to it. Some people may be cynical. But even over at Fox, the reporters were trying to ask how to square this, asking the White House secretary why the White House filing contradicts what the president said.
Caroline, can I ask you for a clarification? It seems there's being a lot made of what Elon Musk's role is actually at Doge. The president has introduced him as the head of Doge multiple times in interviews, yet there's this affidavit that we've been able to get our hands on here that it contradicts the White House claim that he's the head of Doge. This affidavit actually says he doesn't work for Doge at all. So what is his role at Doge?
Sure, I'm happy to clarify. Elon Musk is a special government employee here at the White House, serving at the direction of the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Elon Musk has been tasked with overseeing Doge on behalf of the President and Doge employees.
Now, that statement there was fact-checked, largely true. They have called him a special role employee, which is designed to get him certain loopholes. And other administrations have done that, but never with someone trying to exert this much power. And then you heard her say it. He's running Doge, what they call it. So either Musk is in charge, as Trump in the White House says, or he's not, as Trump's lawyers say, even as they do this joint promotion. And their shared agenda on government cuts is facing mounting protests. A president who seems to know he needs things from this other person, the richest person in the world, who wields one of the most influential digital platforms ever created, because he bought it. He had enough money plus investors and banks to do that. But it is also not just about those two people. It's about another 335 million people, the population of our country, whose very lives and safety can be impacted by those two people's decisions and attempts to gut federal government protections in ways that the two of them did not admit in their boisterous campaign appearances. Do you wonder why these voluble people, these loud people who talk so much, who are effective at PR on TV, online, or whatever new mediums emerge, who've said so many words across hundreds of speeches and thousands of tweets, why they didn't explain the actual full plan that we are now living through? And is it shaping up to be helpful for the people, even for some of the people, like their voters? Or is it more helpful to just themselves? I've told you, we are in an interesting period now. Campaigning is over. The votes are in. So now we get back to civics and governing, and we find out that some of the people who may have been effective at campaigning are incompetent at governing. Twice this week we've had to report on key staff in important projects who were fired and rehired in a day. Not the best people making those decisions when you have nuclear safety experts and bird flu emergency personnel going in and out of the government. So, we're in the governing period. It's not going to be as fun or as interesting necessarily as all the campaign period. It's not supposed to be. And it's not about just counting the past votes. It's about what we in civic life, society, and the fact-based reality community do with what we're living through.
One of the country's top prosecutors, the head of the criminal division at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., that person oversees criminal cases in the nation's capital, has resigned. Her name is Denise Chung. She has been in that office since 2000. She departed abruptly after interim U.S. Attorney Ed Martin asked for her resignation when she refused to send an order to a bank to freeze assets. She believed there was not enough evidence to do that. Chung praised her colleagues in her resignation letter this morning for, quote, following the facts and the law and complying with our moral, ethical, and legal obligations. The need to focus on that exact mission, following the facts and the law, guided by ethical obligations, is the subject of a letter from hundreds of former federal prosecutors, including former special counsel Jack Smith. They write this, quote, as prosecutors, we were rightly prohibited from making criminal charging decisions based on someone's political association, activities, or beliefs, or because of our personal feelings about them. Against this backdrop, we have watched with alarm as these values have been tested by recent actions of the department's leadership. Some of you have been ordered to make charging decisions based expressly on considerations other than the facts and the law, including to serve solely political purposes. Several of you have resigned, and others are wondering what will happen to the department we served and revere. To all of you, we communicate this. We salute and admire the courage many of you have already exhibited, and that will guide all of you as you continue to serve the interests of justice. You have responded to ethical challenges of a type no public servant should ever be forced to confront, with principle and conviction, in the finest traditions of the Department of Justice. Let's bring into our conversation former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann. He signed that open letter to current federal prosecutors we just read from. Also joining us, NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley. Tim is still with us as well. Ryan Riley, on the reporting, do we know whose assets she was asked to freeze that she refused to freeze?
Yeah, three sources tell NBC News this had to do with grants that were put out during the Biden administration involving the environment through the Environmental Protection Agency. But what you're talking about ultimately here is the government ordering is the key word here, a bank to freeze assets that no longer in the possession of the federal government. And in order to meet that threshold, there is a line that you would have to meet, right? And so she was not willing. She said that the evidence did not support writing a letter to the bank telling them to freeze these assets, and that's why she sort of drew the line here. What the letter that I've read, what it lays out is that she was, willing to sign a letter essentially saying that there should should be further investigation here. But what it sounds like is that the FBI was going to be willing to send this letter to the bank, but that she said that, there could be something more investigation looked into this. But, if you step back for a moment, what you have ultimately is, according to her resignation letter, the Deputy Attorney General, Acting Deputy Attorney General of the United States' office directing a criminal prosecution and skipping all of those layers that typically go in between here. The idea was that there was going to be this opening of a criminal investigation involving a line assistant U.S. attorney within the U.S. Attorney's office in D.C., and that was going to be directed by the Deputy Attorney General's office. So, this is another significant resignation. She's someone who's very well respected within the Justice Department and, by a lot of her colleagues. So this is something I think that, is another sort of warning sign about the way that the Trump administration intends to and is using the Justice Department so far.
Well, let me read some of what you're laying out from her letter. She writes this: I was asked to review documentation supplied by the Office of the Deputy Attorney General to open a criminal investigation into whether a contract had been unlawfully awarded by an executive agency before the change in administration and to issue grand jury subpoenas pursuant to this investigation. I was told there was a time sensitivity and action had to be taken that day because there was concern that contract awardees could continue to draw down on accounts handled by the bank handling the disbursements. I conferred with others, all of whom have substantial white-collar criminal prosecution experience, and reviewed documentation provided by the Deputy Attorney General in determining whether the predicate for opening such a grand jury investigation existed. Despite assessing that the existing documents on their face did not meet the threshold, an ODAG, Office of Deputy Attorney General rep, stated that he believes sufficient predication existed, including in the form of a video where statements were made by a former political appointee of the executive agency in question. Clearly, this is sort of the heart. This is the actual, if criminal prosecutions begin at conception, this is conception, right? Is there predicate for investigating a crime? And she says no, and they were going to force her. What does that portend for the department?
Yeah, as you're reading this letter, another thing that also just registered for me is she's so obedient with the Justice Department rules that have been ingrained upon her for 24 years that, even in her resignation letter, she doesn't refer specifically to the entity that we're talking about here because, that would suggest that it would be outside of the four corners of the law, right? Because someone hasn't been charged yet. So she's not going to say, oh, they referred to this video from this former Biden appointee. She puts it in this broad language, so leaves it to us to sort of, as reporters, sort of figure out the details of this. Even in her resignation letter, right? She's still obeying those Justice Department protocols and those rules that are put in place to make sure that individuals' rights aren't violated and that people aren't being smeared with the notion of a criminal investigation when the facts don't merit a criminal investigation. And that's what she ultimately, determined here, is that this was based on the evidence that she had been presented to this point. There was not enough to tell a bank that there was probable cause that a crime had been committed here and to freeze those assets. Because, what you're talking about when you're talking about the EPA freezing grants, and there was a statement from the EPA saying they were going to work with DOJ at one point to look into those, the money that had already been allocated. But that's a political move. That's not about an allegation of actual fraud or wrongdoing. That's basically just saying we didn't like this thing that the old administration did, and we're going to try to claw back some of that money. And that's just not how the constitutional order is meant to work. That was what the old administration did. That money is already out the door. The government, theoretically shouldn't be seizing back money unless there's actual proven, wrongdoing, or at least the suggestion, at least probable cause of wrongdoing here. But that's what you have the Trump administration trying to do. Basically, the Justice Department being just like another agency within the federal government, when that's not the post-Watergate tradition that we have, especially with the working between different agencies that we've seen where they're sort of partnering up. That's, I think, a common thing that we've seen, with U.S. Attorney Ed Martin, for example. He's offered his concierge prosecutorial services to DOJ, saying that, they'll help out with any threats against them. Just very unusual lines of communications that we're seeing.
But I want to make sure I understand what she's alleging. She's alleging that the Deputy Attorney General asked her to fabricate a crime when she didn't see one.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of looking at it. I want to just underscore some things. First, Denise Chung, full disclosure, I've known her for many, many years. She's not a friend, but she's a colleague. Many people have known her. I think one of the things that you and Ryan have pointed out, she's been a prosecutor since for 24 years. That means she is used to serving under many different administrations.
Right.
Nobody would describe her as the deep state. She is your classic worker bee person who you want in government. So that this is who you're dealing with, somebody who has dealt with and worked with Republican and Democratic administrations. So I want to make sure that's just like what we've seen in terms of the resignations of key people in the Southern District of New York. That's who she is. Super reputable, wonderful reputation. Second, I want to make sure people understand, though, what is being said here, what the import is. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, I'm not going to get too nerdy, that is all about protecting all of our privacy. It requires that there's factual predication before there is a search and before there is a seizure. That factual predication means there has to be probable cause. What Denise is saying in her resignation letter is she looked at all of the evidence that was given to her by the Deputy Attorney General's office, and she did not see probable cause. She did not even see enough to really go forward at all. She said, maybe you should look at something, but you cannot issue a freeze letter. Just to be clear, a freeze letter is not some, oh, this is a nice little letter. It's seizing an account. Under the Fourth Amendment, that is a seizure. It requires probable cause. It is a constitutional prohibition on what the government can do unless it has that factual predication. And she is saying, I looked at this, my career people looked at this, and we could not go forward. And she is being told, do it anyway. And for her to resign over this, somebody who is, think of somebody who spent that long devoted to the Justice Department, to public service, and to policies she may have agreed with or disagreed with from time to time. That's what happens when you're in government. You don't agree with everything, but we've talked about this. Elections have consequences. For her to be saying, I cannot do this, it's because it is so over the line, and it is a constitutional prohibition that she is saying, I am not doing that. This could not be more serious, not just because this is like a canary in the coal mine. It's the coal mine coming. It is, you have to put it in context of what we were just talking about, and there's going to be a hearing tomorrow in the Southern District of New York. It's all of a piece of really lawless action that's being ordered to be taken by people who have taken an oath to the Constitution and are willing to suffer the consequences because they're not going to violate that oath.
With us now, NBC News White House correspondent Aaron Gilchrist in West Palm Beach, Florida, near Mar-a-Lago, criminal defense attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalos, and Jeremy Peters, New York Times reporter and MSNBC contributor. So, Aaron, what more do we know about what's going on at Social Security?
Well, Jose, as you mentioned, Michelle King was the top official at the Social Security Administration, and she retired after refusing to give Musk's team access to these sensitive government records you referenced. That's according to two sources, things like bank information, Social Security numbers, birth dates, in some cases medical records. And as you noted, the White House did confirm that King was no longer head of that agency. The president has nominated a new administrator for it. The White House press secretary said that the president has directed DOJ to identify fraud at the Social Security Administration. And as you noted, she said that team hasn't dug through the books there just yet, but it does suspect that there is widespread fraud happening there. And our team looked at an Inspector General report, an audit last year that showed that over a 7-year period, the Social Security Administration made almost $72 billion in improper payments, as they termed it, a little less than 1% of the payments in that time period, 7 years. The report also says that most of those improper payments were overpayments, not payments to dead people, as the press secretary seemed to suggest there, or to people who didn't really qualify for any payments at all, Jose.
I mean, Jeremy, what kind of information? And I want to ask you also about, this thing that's $72 billion over a year period were found, and that's without a detailed analysis, right? That's not with going through minuscule checks. That would be a little over $10 billion a year. But what kind of information, et cetera, could a DOJ into Social Security be looking into?
Well, I think fraud is a big issue here. You know, it's not made up. The extent to which it exists, though, seems to be significantly exaggerated. As long as there has been government aid, of course, Jose, there's been government fraud. People have long sought to take advantage of these government programs, making up whole identities, going after the benefits of dead people even. That does happen, but it's known as, what people in government refer to as an accounting trick. People, when politicians put forward their budgets every year, in every state legislature across the country, they cite savings from the finding of waste, fraud, and abuse. However, they rarely find as much as they say they're going to find, if any at all. So this is hardly, case closed here, I would say.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't recall, and maybe it's just me, I don't recall this type of minuscule search through data, through records, through et cetera, to look into whether there is any kind of, misuse of funds. And the fact that it's, at least according to the Trump administration, going to be going across the board in the federal government, first of all, that's not something that's been done before. I mean, certainly Clinton did some of this. But there's the issue of what's Congress's responsibility.
Right.
And they're the ones that, give the money.
Exactly. And Congress has completely abdicated its responsibility here. I mean, this is what has allowed Trump to take on this really expansive view of executive power. And Republicans, who control all three branches of government, essentially, are not doing anything to stop him. The House and the Senate certainly have not shown any type of backbone or will to stand up for Trump and reassert their authority over budgetary matters, which is what they are supposed to do under this three-branch framework that we have.
Yeah, I mean, and Danny's Social Security records can include all kinds of different things. Is there any kind of potential legal issues here?
Yes. I mean, to name a few, you have the Federal Privacy Act, you have the Internal Revenue Code. Those all have strict rules about disclosure. But it's really interesting. A decision came out yesterday involving the Department of Education and a challenge to access of that information. And this is a decision that I think folks should look at, because it's one district court judge concluding that there's a difference when it comes to determining irreparable harm. There's a difference between disclosing information to the public and internal agency disclosure within the agency of that information. Even if there is a risk that that information could be disclosed publicly, those statutes I just mentioned have remedies for that. And these plaintiffs, at least in the Department of Education case involving this kind of access, the court found that disclosure internally may not be the kind of irreparable harm that would warrant a restraining order. Now, it's not the final word. There's going to be so much litigation on this, but that's one interesting take by one court.
So, Danny, in civilian talk, what's the difference between internal and external?
Well, the idea is bringing these DOJ folks in. They're getting deployed technically as members of the agency for several months. So if they access that information, the response by the administration is going to be, well, that's internal. It's not like it's getting put out in the public. It's not publicly available. It's not on a website. It's not something people are supposed to access. The same rules of privacy apply to someone who comes in from DOJ as to somebody who is already in there, although there are all kinds of complex rules, for example, in the IRS about even who can access that sensitive information in the agency. Not everybody gets access. So this is going to be the subject of a lot of legal challenges, and the district court decisions are hardly the final stop. Many of them may go up all the way to the end, the Supreme Court.
And Aaron, we're also getting word this morning that the Food and Drug Administration's food head is also leaving.
Yeah, there are some reports, Jose, that the head of the food division at the FDA stepped down yesterday because of cuts across that particular agency. When our team asked the White House about those reports, the press secretary did provide a statement to us, and I'll read part of it for you here. It says that there are a number of bureaucrats who are resistant to the democratic process and mandate delivered by the American people. President Trump is only interested in the best and most qualified people who are also willing to implement his America First agenda on behalf of the American people. It's not for everyone, and that's okay. That is the extent of the statement, Jose, we got from Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary.
And Jeremy, there's a clear intent to kind of downplay from the White House Elon Musk's role in all of this. What's that all about?
It's about Trump trying to reassert his authority as the president, which Elon Musk seems sometimes to forget that Trump actually is. I mean, look, this picture right here. This is not a good look. The White House and President Trump especially do not want an image like that. Elon Musk standing up, looming over a sitting, quiet president of the United States. I mean, it kind of blows my mind, and I know it ruffled a lot of feathers internally in Trump world, that Elon in this picture speaks 1,000 words.
Even though that was kind of, it was set up.
Staged.
It was staged. It wasn't a surprise.
Well, it shouldn't have been a surprise. And I think that we are all waiting to see when the bottom drops out here. I mean, this is not a sustainable relationship. Ever since the two of them started working together, these two huge personalities and egos inevitably will clash. And it will be, at some point, I'm sure, the final straw for Trump. As you know, someone inside Trump world told me not that long ago, this relationship will end in tears.
Danny, meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal is out with a big piece on how President Trump has used emergency powers to advance policy objectives, writing, quote, I'm going to read this, his declaration of an energy emergency comes as U.S. oil production is at or near record highs. Trump's border actions come as illegal crossings have dropped substantially, even though one could argue that maybe those drops are because of in no small part, the different actions taken by the Trump administration on day one. Is there a specific definition or test that needs to be met in order to declare an emergency?
Short answer is not really. The National Emergencies Act sought to reel in some of the presidential power to issue or declare these national emergencies. But it really hasn't done much to give us a definition. There's guidance in different statutes because what it does is it requires the president to issue a declaration and cite the federal statute under which he has that kind of emergency power. So, for example, IEPA is a statute that deals with international money. So there has to be some reason related to international money or financing. That's just one example. So there isn't a hard definition, but since we're already living under dozens of national emergencies without knowing it, that shows that the National Emergencies Act, because back then there were 4 when it was passed, has not done that much to either define national emergencies or reel them in, which was its original intent.
Aaron Gilchrist, Danny Cevallos, and Jeremy Peters, thank you all so much. What do we know about these talks today and the news that the Ukrainian delegation is postponing its trip to Riyadh?
Well, Jose, I think the fact that President Zelensky isn't coming here, we thought tomorrow, is an indication. I mean, he was racing to get here. It's an indication that the pace of things has been slowed a little by this meeting today. 2 really, I think, big headlines from what happened today. On the one hand, we aren't about to see a summit between President Trump and President Putin in the coming week or 2. That's not going to be, they're not going to hurtle towards that. There's going to be more preparation before something like that happens, more negotiation. On the other hand, that's not to underestimate the really tectonic shift that we're seeing here, because remember that the West, that's Europe and the United States and American allies, had held a very united front, not completely, but very united front, isolating Russia. That is now different. What we saw today was the first formal talks between U.S. senior officials and their Kremlin counterparts since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, breaking through that isolation, and a bunch of proposals, including restoring missions, talking even about geopolitics and economics, some kind of cooperation around that. That's a really, really big shift.
Yeah, and Kieran, this morning, the Trump administration confirmed that American Caleb Byers is released from Russia. What do we know about that?
That's right. So he is an American citizen who was just very recently arrested for carrying a small amount of drugs, very small. Now, he was released very quickly before these talks, and the Kremlin saying today that was, something that they deliberately did in the build-up to these talks. So there's clearly been a view from the Kremlin that they would want to try to set a positive tone. And I've got to tell you, right now, Russian television is showing pictures of the two delegations smiling, kind of cordial appearing. Foreign Minister Lavrov saying in a news conference that the relationship between Russia and the US need to be improved, saying that's what we did today, and I would say, frankly, not without success. So the Russian delegation appeared to be, frankly, pleased, if not delighted, with what happened here in Riyadh. Of course, that may not be the case for the Ukrainians, and certainly not for the Europeans.
And so, Keir, in those images of the two sides, along with the foreign minister, I should say, of Saudi Arabia, do we know what now is next for these delegations? Now that, there's no Ukrainian representation there in any fashion going forward, do we know how long these Riyadh meetings are going to continue?
Look, I mean, this was a hastily put together meeting. It's a work in progress. You really get that impression. That being said, they have talked about setting up two high-level working groups. President Zelensky now saying he's going to come here to Saudi Arabia in March. And I will say one other thing, and I think it's important to note, Jose, President Trump's envoy for Russia and Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, in a briefing overnight, saying that he plans to spend 3 days in Ukraine this week. He plans to go back multiple times, that he will brief President Trump on the view from Ukraine. So something like a pause, perhaps an opportunity for the Europeans to have their say, to have some influence. But, and this is a big caveat, we haven't heard from President Trump yet. And of course, President Trump is the one who decides U.S. foreign policy.
Keir Simmons in Riyadh, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Joining us now is former State Department Senior Advisor Nayera Haq. Nayera, thank you for being with us. So 4.5 hours of discussions this morning. State Department released a readout of the meeting, writing in part, quote, "The parties to today's meetings pledge to remain engaged to make sure the process moves forward in a timely and productive manner." What do you make and what do you take out of the diplomatic language in that readout?
Well, that's a saving faith readout because what it's really trying to do is allow for these talks to continue. It's hard to have peace talks when one party is not showing up. And the Ukrainians are not happy at this point that the United States is rushing to meet with Vladimir Putin, going directly to the top and having the secretaries of state and foreign ministers sit down. The Ukrainians want to understand what's the pivot from these 3 years of U.S. support. And the Ukrainians have been willing to fight. Russia has taken 20% of their land, but has not gained any more ground. So the Ukrainians are fighting for their livelihood. The Europeans are fighting against Russian aggression. And now the big question mark is, why is the United States rushing to the table with Russia?
And the Europeans are also fighting for at least to have a voice, because it seems as though the Western European nations so far have played very little role in this new reality that we're seeing. Matt, I want to ask you, with your deep and profound knowledge of Russia and the Russian government, what do you think Putin's aim is in these talks? They just released that American before the talks. What is Putin's aim here?
Thanks, Jose. It's a great question. I think, speaking broadly, what the Kremlin is looking for here, or what they see here, is an opportunity, if not at least to extract some kind of major concessions from an administration that they seem to feel more closely aligns with their worldview, or at least their style of doing business, these sort of big, grandiose one-on-one talks. Then at least it's an opportunity to be heard or speak to the U.S. at a very high level directly. Take, for example, this statement by the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov Peskov today, saying that there's now reason to believe that America is listening better to Russia's position. And so I think this is really just as much about the entire optics of what we're seeing right now as it is any sort of concrete outcome. But that isn't to downplay the optics. I think from a certain perspective, the optics are important and potentially devastating for Ukraine. I think so much of Ukraine's will to fight, or at least the confidence that they bring to the fight, has for the last 3 years been rooted in this idea that America is with us, particularly America, but also Europe, of course, and that there was this grand united front presented towards the Kremlin, against the Kremlin, and that has sort of been shattered over the past week. And we've seen Ukrainian officials and European officials scrambling to try to figure out how to address this, because it's really a major change in U.S. policy. So the Kremlin, I think, is looking at this and is really quite pleased with what they're getting so far. You know, there's been some sort of muted reactions to the meeting so far, but a process is underway that a year ago, even a few months ago, was frankly very difficult to imagine. And that is, of course, the United States sitting down with Russia without anyone else at the table. That's exactly what the Kremlin wants to see. What specific outcome we get, I think, is still very much up in the air. But even just right now, President Putin tonight, and I think we'll see this on Russian state media over the next few days, can claim to the Russian public, can show the Russian public that these efforts to isolate him, to isolate Russia, to ignore their concerns have failed, are failing, and that there is an opportunity here. Jose?
No doubt, Matt, although I have to reaffirm once that there, as far as optics and other things, it is the United States meeting with the Russians, but also the Saudi foreign minister sitting in those meetings as well. And Matt, Kremlin, going back to Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, he spoke this morning about the possibility of Ukraine joining the European Union, saying that nobody, including Moscow, would dictate anything here, but it's another matter when it comes to military blocs. What is Russia's underlying message here, Matt?
It's an interesting statement because so much of the European Union membership overlaps with NATO. I think it just goes to show, again, this long-standing fixation by Russian policymakers on NATO, on the idea of NATO and Ukraine potentially being in NATO. It also sort of represents potentially an expansion of the Kremlin's demands of Ukraine, of NATO. You know, for the most part, what we know of Russia's negotiating position at this time is it looks almost exactly as it did the day before the war, back when Russia was issuing essentially an ultimatum for the West to back off, to disband NATO in Eastern Europe and essentially demobilize and get away from Russia and let Ukraine essentially stands unprotected. So it's an interesting distinction. It's not necessarily one that I've seen before from them, but it's hard to know what to make of it, Jose.